Hello, adventurers. I am your Dice20 host, Dan DePietro, and today we're going to be talking about the three pillars of Dungeons and Dragons. The three pillars are exploration, combat, and social interaction. We discuss what it means to us on how to approach them, how we approach designing campaigns and story arcs using them, and some tips and tricks along the way. So before we get into it, hit that subscribe button, and without further ado, let's dive into it. All right, so here we are. We have John up top, we have Mike down on the top right, and then we have John Vespa on the bottom right. And so we'll be getting right into the three pillars of D&D, and those pillars are combat, social interactions, and exploration. I think it's commonly understood what combat is. Social interactions is, the communication, whether it's using NPCs or even the party members talking to each other. And then exploration we can dive into, but there's quite a lot of discussions online to what exactly exploration means, because it could mean travel, it could mean searching things, it could mean lore. So there's quite a few things about that. So let's get right into it. And when you guys are designing an adventure or even a campaign arc, but let's think of like a single session. So that's kind of your 3 or 4 hour mark. So tonight's your session. You've designed something up. Do you guys have any specific thoughts on what you bring to the table that night? Is there some sort of guiding principle that you think about?
I would say that I never consider it explicitly. I mean, I tried to go for some mix of combat and non-combat, which I think also historically I have tended to think more in those binaries than in the terms of the three pillars. And I mean, we can circle back to this, but I'm also fine with any particular session leaning more towards one than the other. And I just tend to balance it out more over the course of the arc. But I never really sit down with a specific percentage of each that I'm trying to reach.
Yeah, I would say that I probably hit 2 usually, like 2 out of 3 of those things per 4 hours. I would say is kind of how it seems to work out. Thinking back about sessions I ran and how these things come up, it seems like 2 of the 3 I'll hit, and then maybe the third one not so much.
Yeah. And so, what do you think the 2 of the 3 are? Social and combat?
Yeah, usually.
And then there's
what's interesting,
or exploration left out in the cold where it should be.
What's interesting though? I think exploration is a lot easier to deal with now in this day and age with all these maps and everything that's out there. It's so easy to, I think, encompass that exploration and with the new kind of tools you have at your behest here. So I don't think that's a hard one. Right?
In first edition, I think you had to buy a separate booklet that had this whole travel thing going on, and it was, I mean, it was harrowing experience just to get there and get back with your treasure.
I'm just thinking of grid paper, and now right. You have all these maps that are gridded, and it's it's a whole thing. So I think it's easier than ever for exploration to be encompassed. But we got off subject there. So usually 2 out of 3, but exploration is the one that's left out in the cold.
John, what about you?
I think in 5e opened the door to allowing different kinds of exploration in particular. So, and that's played out a lot with, I think as well, all the streaming stuff that goes on these days with D&D, the podcast world of D&D, all these sort of live play scenarios gave people a different kind of introduction to the game that involved a lot more, social interaction role play that you can use as exploration. You were saying earlier, Dan, that lore can be an avenue of explanation, right. Exploration, for instance. And I just think the way 5e is designed, and the way that it was introduced to the world is why we kind of see that door being opened wider too. I agree with John on that.
I'd agree and slightly respectfully disagree on the idea that maybe 5e has made it easier for some people, but I feel like exploration's always been there, whether you're talking about the grid paper where the DM's describing a dungeon and you're mapping it as you go along. That's still exploring. Or also, I mean, fantastical locations like the astral plane, the Nine Hells. Like there
Oh
are
yeah.
some incredible locations going all the way back to first edition D&D that are mind blowing to take a character there. And I guess for me, that's it's not so exploration is not so much the overland travel, which is really hard, and at least for me to do well. But what I do enjoy is, as a fan of 80s sword and sorcery films, as a fan of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, like the reveal, like finding a new place that
Oh, totally agree.
like having that, whether it's a mental image or what I definitely think you and Vesper are both right about nowadays is the extra visual aids available make that part of it a lot easier to either pull off some web art or pull up a battle map or something. I think really helps enable, instead of just having to give just a word spiel.
Mm-hmm. That's
I think for me though, it's when you talk about the exploration, sometimes I think it's hard to explain to the players what world you imagine them living in and interacting in. And so I think part of the exploration to me is that lore piece and showing them, well, you find an ancient statue and the gods can interact with them at that point, or they found out that there was different gods back in this time period or something like that. And you get this more well-rounded 3D aspect through the exploration, and sort of it shows your players some new avenues that they can actually interact with the world, and then they can take that information and say, well, we saw this statue, now we're going to bring that into some social discussions, and maybe once we know that, we know how to deal with some of the combat scenarios because it's given us more information or something like that. That's why I think the exploration is a little more subtle sometimes than saying, okay, you've traveled an extra day, mark down a ration sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nobody keeps track of those anymore.
Yeah, isn't the next town always within 10 rations, I think?
Yeah, I think Mike made a really good point too, that there are some pretty amazing locations in the older editions. The one that always comes to mind for me is Planescape, because it's just incredibly cool to me, and such a weird and different sort of thing, shockingly so, as you go running around the different parts of Outland. But that's kind of what I think of as like classical exploration, but the lore conditioning, the other aspects you guys are getting into, that's what I mean by 5e opening the door a little bit more. It's just there are other things that count now.
Sure.
That I think, and I think that's
Right.
a good thing. I think the games get a lot richer as a result of that.
Do you think that where do you think narration fits in, or if you're doing some sort of narrated scene where the players sort of take a back seat, is that part of scenario description, or is that part of the exploration part of it as you get to a new place? Like, how do you think that fits in, or is that just sort of standard to you have these three pillars and then the narrator also sets the tone there?
I think it depends on what you're narrating, right? If you're so for instance, a lot of times in games I'll run online, I'll have an image up, like Mike was saying, I pulled some fantasy art off the internet of a mountainside or a jungle or whatever it happens to be. I tend to have some music running with it in the background just to create some ambience, and then we'll read a description of what it is, the environment that you are in, as you're traveling. So then you
Right.
get all of that does set into an exploration kind of movement, right? Because I'm trying to move you through the world. But if you're narrating a ball or a tavern brawl, I don't know. Is that exploration? Probably not. So it kind of depends, in my opinion.
I mean, which is a good point, because some exploration discussions that I saw in looking up the idea here is, you get to a door well, now you're exploring the door. So it's sort of interesting to think of it on a macro scale where you're traversing the map, and then on the micro scale are looking at a door and trying to check it out for, traps or problems. And because I think that's the other thing that falls into the exploration category is traps and things like that. So, I mean, I guess that's a good question. Like, do traps and puzzles make it into your games a lot?
Very much so.
Maybe I'm not giving myself enough credit. Maybe I do hit all three of these things if exploration counts as a door.
I hear your point, though. Like, it's a struggle sometimes to make it a point to say, yeah, I'm going to have that exploration piece in it, though.
I mean,
I think it does happen naturally, though.
Anyone who's ever been really drunk before can tell you getting through a door or up a flight of stairs can be a very challenging experience. Like, this is...
I think if you get through a couple maps, in a Roll20 session, I think like you're probably hitting that exploration mark one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, if you got a rogue, they're stealthing through it, and and maybe picking that lock or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think narration can fit into all three. I mean, again, especially if you don't have a battle map or you don't have pictures that you're sharing. I mean, if you're going really old school, a verbal description is going to be all they get of the environment, and you're trying to really paint that for them, and that is its own form of exploration. Or if it's a big speech being given by an NPC, then that's an RP narration. Or if you're setting up the combat room, just describing the area. I mean, it's exploration and combat. If you're hiding details about tactical bonuses or weaknesses that may be available, if they are clever enough to pick up on that in your narration before you actually start rolling initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, I don't think you can. I think it's just exploration is subtle, right? Like, because you're going to explore the room after the combat in some way, right? So it's always there. It just doesn't seem like it takes center stage in some way. Like you can't think to yourself prior to the session, like, okay, well, when I'm going to have this great exploration of a room. You just sort of expect that that's going to happen, just like you expect them to fight the zombies that were in the room, right? It's sort of an expectation, but it is sort of like in your design an exclamation point, like, yeah, there's zombies in this fucking room and they're gonna fight, but maybe they miss all the shit because they didn't explore, and that's on them. So it's sort of a hard thing sometimes to say, oh, I'm making a point for exploration here.
I think another thing to consider in all that discussion and in really the involvement of all three pillars is, and you guys have already done a session on this, but a session 0. If you can figure out what your players are really interested in, then you can lean in one direction or another as you progress through telling that story. If they're combat heavy people, or if they're folks who just want to meet every single person in the tavern and learn their entire life story, you could. There's all kinds of players, right? So you can kind of gear your campaign more in that direction if you take the time to consider,
I agree.
Your players
certainly knowing your audience for sure.
Mm-hmm.
My only question is, I mean, you're sitting down for 3-4 hours, like, to not shift the pacing somewhere along at least halfway through. I mean, do you think that gets dull? Like, what if you had an entire session of combat or an entire session of role play? Like, does that bother you? I know it bothers some people sometimes. I felt it on both ways. Sometimes I'm like, oh man, an entire fucking combat just lasted 3 hours. Like, it was important, right? There was a point for the combat. Maybe it was a big bad guy, right? But like, it's like, oh, did that drag on? Was there enough interest in it? And same thing with role playing, where it's like, gosh, did I move the plot enough through role play? Because I didn't have a single combat to like overcome the next obstacle, Do you guys feel that at all?
I don't shy away from really leaning on any of the pillars for a particular session. It's just then I am very mindful going into the next session that I then try to balance it back out. Like especially like I said, if it's an epic combat, like I have done save the village, and like with some simulated mass combat, some narratives going on outside between the town guard and the goblins, and the heroes have their own things to do. But it's just a progression of various combats with narrative outcomes, and it's the entire session. And then the next session's all role playing as they're helping the town rebuild, and meeting with the village elders and figuring out, well, we need to track these people back to their lair. And then now you have your exploration part of tracking tracking the bandits down, and then there may not be a single combat in the next adventure. So I mean, if there's a good reason, try not to fly back and forth too much, but when there's a good justification, I also sometimes, I mean, as long as I am prepared well enough, I'll just see what my players are responding the best to. If they're really having a good time with a particular role-playing encounter, I'll just let it keep going and not force it to a conclusion.
Right, yeah, you got to let that, if that pacing is driving with that scenario, you got to let it go, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it allows, it gives your players more what's the word? More sort of power to help determine where the narrative is going, or what thing you're going to be doing next, or what is the thing of interest, if you give them the option to figure that stuff out. Another way of dealing with that is you can have a session that's an entire combat and still make that work if you're still moving the story through it. If you're still moving the narrative along through your combat. If it's just, slay infinite goblins, well, that's probably not doing much. But if there's a change of scenery in the combat, like the top of the castle gets blown off and now you're battling this dragon on a roof, or there's all kinds of other, pieces of information.
Classic, you've halfway beat the bad guy and now the second phase starts.
Exactly.
The face boss battle, man. You always got to do the face boss battle.
Yes. It is sort of a classic.
Have you guys successfully done the combining two of the pillars into one, such as what if you had a moral decision to either fight the bad guy or save the village, right? Do you toy with that a lot? Sometimes I find that sometimes it's a little bit harder to more specifically plan that into a session, unless it's part of the narrative for some reason. But sometimes that's harder to plan ahead and say, I'm going to really ramp up the tension with this. But how have you guys dealt with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, because I think you're right on with what you're saying, that is hard to plan for. So it's hard to think back about any time that I've planned something like that, because most of the time that's not the case, So I don't know. What are you guys' thoughts?
I think for me, I have a hard time planning that ahead. So I use time as a way to push concerns and plot points forward. So you could either go to this point or that point, but you have to make a decision. But then the rest of the session sort of flows in that one direction, right? So it's not necessarily, a single combat where you need to make a huge moral choice of doing A or B, but it's more like part of the role-playing portion of it where they're discussing socially, should we do this or that? And then that sets the tension for the rest of the scene. But it is hard to kind of do both at the same time, I think, to kind of have 2 points come to a head.
Yeah, my favorite of that is just to create. I've seen you, being a player in your games before, use time in that way. I know exactly what you're talking about when you say that. And it is interesting. It makes you. It's time as a resource like anything else. So it puts tension into the game about, oh God, I hope we get this decision right. I like doing it as well with just two options that are very attractive. That don't even have to do with time per se, or attractive in their mystery or intrigue. Maybe not necessarily because they're such a positive choice or whatever, but you know, the ability to, the option even to like sort of double agent or to do choices like that, those can be a way to do both, I think. But you're right, it's tricky. I mean, it is tough to prepare for, really.
I mean, I think the phased boss battle would be the kind of thing that would fill both
There
of
you
these.
go.
Or, I mean, it doesn't just have to be that, but I mean, it could be a more, narratively or tactically challenging type of combat, such as, they're not just trying to get across, the rickety rope bridge. They're trying to do it while goblins are shooting arrows at them the entire time from
Right. Yeah, that's a
an
little bit of
elevated
exploration
position.
too.
Yeah.
It's that you have to start thinking more creatively. It's not just initiative to attack the goblin. I've also had happy accidents. I mean, I definitely had one campaign where the very first session, brand new characters just starting out, and the town's attacked by a dragon. And this is kind of the thing that draws them together. This was my kind of twist
So
on the
TPK session 1. That's what
but it was
happy
them
accident.
it was them avoiding the dragon until one character nat won the stealth check and was stuck out there, and the character I narrate such that she like tripped over a barrel, made this huge crash, and she knows she screwed up. So her solution to help their players is she runs out to the street to directly confront the dragon, who lands down, and then she starts having a conversation with it, and the classic like Bilbo and Smaug style, and manages to just, based purely on RP, I enjoyed it enough that I allowed her to basically charm her way out of being eaten. The dragon felt she was no threat and was just amused enough by her behavior that he let her go.
Yeah.
But that was absolutely could have gone either way. The combat TPK threat overhung the RP, but made it that much more rewarding when the role play was successful.
That's a great one. I like that story.
I had a scenario where I tried to combine combat and a discussion where the bad guy offered a different choice. Like, it doesn't have to be this way. So what if you took my gold and did this instead in the middle of combat? And that I found was sort of tricky because you're asking each of your players to do a 6-second discussion, and yet fireballs are being thrown, and I think it worked out fun. But that was one of the adventures I designed and put on Roll20, and I'm I haven't seen any feedback, but I'm curious how that works for people, because that's a hard one to manage, and usually just somebody dies.
In my experience, anytime the big bad gives the players a choice like that, they inevitably try to do both. Like they never seem to want to treat it like a choice, and always try to treat it like something to game, and try to figure out a way to, well, let's take his money and then backstab him. And like,
right.
You're not heroes anymore at this point. You're bad. You're liars and extortionists. Like, you're just bad people now.
Wait, what's the difference between a hero and a mercenary? You know what? Forget it.
I'm sure those dragons or whatever had it coming, Mike. Let's be honest.
Yeah, they were evil. Are there any pillars that you guys have problems with? Like, you dislike a certain aspect of it, or feel like it's lacking?
Well, I'll tell you what. Almost this is back to what we were talking about as far as like having one session of just like one pillar. It's tough when you have a larger table, let's say like 7 people, and you run these combats and you're like, man, this is really going to drag out for a while, and there's not much you can do about it, honestly. If you want to keep it engaging, you want it to be challenging, you want to try to check these boxes for it to be that combat. But then it's certainly, it's going to be 2.5 hours in or something, and you're like, all right, well, hope everyone's enjoyed this, So sometimes I think combat is actually the most challenging one, and that's my personal opinion. As far as that, plus building the combats to check all those boxes for challenging, like they're set up well, and all those things that I want the combat to be. So for me, that
That's
was the
true.
most.
Even in exploration, even if you are like traveling across a country, I know in mine it's like I have different things set up along the way. They're random encounters, but I plan them, and at least I can very easily change pacing to say, hey, you meet a dryad, you're in the middle of the woods, or hey, there's a goblin tribe, you're in the middle of the woods, or there's a giant river to cross, you're in the middle of the woods. Like you can very quickly change pacing in exploration, but sometimes in combat, yeah, you're sort of once you say roll initiative, you're locked in.
Yeah, you're locked in. Yeah.
You could also, do what you did and have a villainous NPC who offers a choice that's interesting. Or you could, there are definitely ways to hit the escape button, right? Get out of that thing. But
yeah, one of the things to me is like when you are using characters that are NPCs that are alive, they might not want to die.
Yeah, they can just run away, right? Sure.
Right. I mean, you get low, they run away. So you can sort of, this one failed its, courage test, and off it goes. Right.
The old courage roll.
Yeah. I've definitely done that. The funny thing about that, though, is, of course, what happens if you guys see an NPC turn tail and run? What do you do to that guy?
Chase, right?
Yeah, it's like a cat and mouse, right?
Yeah, I mean, unless they have like Dimension Door or something, they're not getting away, right?
I like the exploration one, but I think it's definitely easier to fall on combat or role play much more easily. Would you guys agree?
I would
Yeah,
agree.
I still think exploration is pretty easy right now, where you can flip through these maps and everything, and like you can build a combat encounter or set up whatever you're going to set up, and you have those visual, I don't know, they're just aids, I guess, but it's just so different than it used to be to have to try to get you to actually envision these things in your mind. Now you can actually have these live drawings, and there's animated things that you can incorporate, all kinds of stuff that really feed you into that exploration. So like for me, I think that one's probably easier to hit than combat or the social aspect.
I think it's also.
Oh, go ahead.
I think it's also useful to keep your synonyms in mind. If you want to say exploration, fine. But I know a lot of people seem to default to that being travel, but it can be investigation, it can be discovery. I think all of those are like your synonyms there are important. Like the discovery, going back to your lore idea, the investigation, going back to it all take place in a room. But if it's searching that room for clues to a murder, well, then now it's an entirely new proposition, and that could take up to an hour of session time, is trying to track down all the clues in a house as to who killed the noble.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to bring into that, because exploration does become sort of a catch-all. Do you think downtime actions fall into that, or like crafting and things like that?
I guess they could either be that or the social interaction. I mean, of course, this goes back to be, again, historically thought this more of combat versus non-combat, and more of a two sides of a coin versus the three pillars.
That's interesting. Is that how you typically look at it, like combat versus non-combat kind of thing?
Historically, yes. The stuff that Wizards has put out for 5e on the three pillars, I think is illuminating. I think it's useful in helping to think about designing sessions and adventures. But once again, I don't want to tie myself down to one conception or the other to the point of stilting my story or my creativity in any way. I think it's a useful framework, but to think of them as you must have exactly 33.33% of each in every session is now you're starting to hamstring
I
yourself.
think that's where it comes to an art as opposed to math, right? Like you're painting that picture, and you're not really sure how long that's going to take. John, you and I once spoke, and the way I saw it, you remember that game where you grab the baseball bat, and then they grab with their other hand, and then you keep going up until you're at the top. That's how I always envisioned the pillars, where if you have combat now, then you're going to switch to kind of something else. And it's sort of like this picturesque framework of how it might work out, because you're going to have the combat, and then you're going to go to the city, and then you're going to role play, and then you have to go into the below, and so that's a little bit of exploration, right? So I sort of think of them, even though that's a little bit more like blocky, of how to approach scenarios, and then you let the players sort of meld each thing in between. But that's how I look at it a lot of times. But you could look at it combat, non-combat as well, very easily.
Yeah, for sure. There's there's two, like, going back to kind of like the one pillar sort of session. There's just sessions like that. Like sometimes everyone needs to go shopping, and you're going to do that for 2 hours or whatever. Or a classic one I think of is, your whole party is out in some elemental plane and comes back to the world, and it's been a month. There's probably a lot they got to catch up on. I mean, they need to read the news, so to speak. And it might take some time to get them fitted with what they need to drive the story forward. I think if you plan well, you can dodge some of that by just having hints around some other way, or having created options for them when they get back from this other plane prior to them leaving. Setting up those sort of hooks is another way to kind of deal with that. But sometimes it just happens. It's okay. I agree with Mike. Like, I wouldn't fight it if that's where my players are putting it.
Right, of course.
Yeah, and sometimes, just like John's saying right there, is like you only have so much control over what actually happens in these, as these things, as the session goes, and it's really up to the player. So you just have to be ready for whatever transition that may lead you to.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's the idea of the plan or the framework, right? So sometimes for me, it's like I look at it in my planning where it's one activity to the next. Maybe you call that the pillar, right? But you might be crafting, or I might be expecting downtime of some sort, right? So it could be you travel to a new place and then you have a downtime, right? Which is kind of two pillar explorations, or you could, non-combat. But if you go from one activity to the next, right, it'll sort of seamlessly flow. And then if players want to stay in one or the other, right? I mean, you just allow that to flow, and you don't fight that whatsoever, right?
That's how I look about it. I let the players do it, the playing, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of the newer DMs, they are concerned about that, though. Like, how do I plan a session? It's easy to throw in a monster, but when you think about it, how do you plan it? Or do you not plan at all, right? That's kind of the question. I think for me, it's, does each of these activities add a plot point, right? Like the fight should not just be a random encounter. It should probably be something that adds something to the world, right? So
should have meaning, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Each activity should have some sort of meaning, preferably.
I think there's a couple layers to planning, right? So you plan, you have an overarching thought of what you think the direction of the campaign or whatever it may be, but session to session, you have these different maybe plot points, and and maybe you plot these things along. And so I probably only plan like 2 sessions ahead of what I think will happen, as far as
That
I
makes
have
sense. I agree.
I have overarching ideas of where I think we're going to lead to, but that's as far as I go out with like my planning personally.
Yeah, because you got 6 problems and they're called players, and they're going to change that shit real quick.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so there's only so much value to that.
Yeah, I don't think you should overplan. Like, I know a lot of people that I've talked to do. They really do. They way overplan. I don't think that's necessary, because you're just going to scrap that 3 hours of extra work.
Yeah,
it's just useless.
See,
that doesn't happen all the time, but that can happen, and so that's just the concern.
I've definitely been that person, and sometimes I don't regret it. It might be more of I will do decision trees sometimes for sessions or over the course of like a particular arc. I might do a decision tree just so I know, okay, if the player, I try to think of what are the most likely, decisions the players will make, or at least by type, and then what are going to be the narrative consequences of each one. And I can still kind of ad lib from there. But I think that just goes to personal style. Some DMs are much more improvisational. I tend to feel more comfortable with the extra planning, and then if I do have to improv, I just feel more confident when I do because I have more resources to fall back on.
You can always recycle what you had planned anyway. So like that's the beauty of that, is like you can just try to throw that back in somewhere else.
What, you're all for the quantum ogre then? Whether you go left or right, there's an ogre.
No matter what.
It feels like you the players made a decision. You're an asshole, John.
Was there ever any doubt in that?
If the players never find out that regardless of the decision, the ogre was going to be there, then
it's Schrodinger's cat
on the back burner. Then he might show up later. You just don't know.
It's Schrodinger's cat. Is it in the box or not? Where was it always?
Yeah.
Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah. I agree with Mike though. I definitely have been guilty of some over planning, but I find it very useful when it becomes time to improv, that I've made myself think through all this stuff because it's just in there in the noggin, kind of ready to go. And then secondly, it's fun. I like doing it, so it's not
the creation process.
Yeah, I love that part. So to me, it doesn't feel like a couple hours extra work. It feels like a couple hours more fun I got to have. And I definitely would agree with John too about if there's a thread of things that, a narrative thread or whatever that you started to build out, or a decision tree option that you made that wasn't taken, you could still recycle it back into that campaign or others, or reskin it, or there's a lot. That work's usually not wasted. There's usually something that's applicable to later on that you'll be glad you did it then.
So how big is your Google Drive with D&D documents?
That's I'm sure
atrociously big.
Yeah, there's so many things like side quest adventures. It's like whoosh.
Yep.
I can't even look through it. I have to search it with a word.
Yep. It's insane.
I've got like 4 character portraits on mine. That's it. I don't do much.
Oh,
I think for me, when I do those, because I do the decision points too, but sometimes if I don't expect a group to go a certain way, I might just write just a couple notes. I won't actually plan it, but I'll just write a few notes just so I have that confidence as if I planned it. Yeah, because it's like at least the thought's there, right? Like, okay, well, the caravan's leaving. I don't expect them to go with them, but if they did, this is what's going to happen on the road. And from there, I can at least ad lib it and just be like, okay, so here's what happens. And then, of course, since I have all these map assets, I just throw stuff at it and just make it happen, right? But I just feel comfortable having a single bullet point of saying, this is what happens, even if it's not planned with like all the characters and, different types of NPCs. I know a little bit about what's next.
Mm-hmm.
My bullet point always says, here be dragons. Just they're gonna fight a dragon. It's gonna happen.
You hear a dragon roar. That's all it's saying.
Yeah, I have some good I'm gonna say like lockers of NPCs lying around that if I need to do something like that, I can throw them in. And they all are their own little well, they're not all, but potentially could be their own little story hooks or little side quests or little whatevers.
Interesting.
So that if I need to have time, or if it feels like, even in terms of pacing, like, okay, we've been walking down this mountainside for 5 years. I need to do something to break this up because I haven't planned this correctly. So I'm going to put something in that provides social interaction, or I'm going to put something in that's a little combat, while still trying to let those things have meaning and not be flippant exercises.
Right.
I like that idea. I try to have So like I'll have you come to some point in the session and I'll have something set up where, okay, we roll a dice and I have like maybe 4 different outcomes. And then whatever one pops up, I'll have that one ready and I'll bring that one into play, whatever that is. And sometimes that's non-combat as well, right?
Mhm.
So.
A true sandboxer. You're ready for the random roll, huh?
Oh, I try to be, yeah, absolutely. I'll keep stuff that I've made and like I said, like recycle something. It doesn't necessarily have to be that hook, but it could be the maps and everything else that went along with it.
Mhm. That's
See, I do have a problem for me because I guess I like to have a little more control, but the random roll, because I don't know what comes along with that. I'm not quick enough in the moment to just like figure that out and to make it into an interesting session sometimes. I mean, I think I could probably do it. I don't give myself enough credit, but that's hard for me because for me it's like then I'm gonna bomb that session and feel shitty about it. Not because you guys probably had a great time watching me struggle, but
Well, like I said, I mean, if you have the 4 potential outcomes already set up, then it's smooth sailing. Really, you just have to have those already set up, and play through that in your mind as well as what the, what's going to be, or what could be,
potential
So that's
outcomes.
what I think. Yeah, potential outcomes, right?
Yeah.
And the tough part is then you have 4 different scenarios, and you have maybe 2 to 3 potential different outcomes of each scenario. So you've got a bunch of different kind of threads there. But as long as you visualize those, I think they're really easy. I mean, the outcomes is pretty easy to discern, right?
So I guess the question is, because we've sort of naturally moved away from the pillars a little bit and started discussing the outcomes. So would you say you more plan the outcomes than the actual pacing of the pillars? Is that because you just think the pillars will happen as they happen and you wouldn't even worry about it, so it's not really part of your design, or you're more interested in the outcomes in that sense?
I think I planned the outcomes, but then with the understanding that the narrative consequence of whatever choices get made likely represent a pillar in some way, like whether it's going to lead to a combat or social interaction or whatever exploration. So yes and no. I guess yes to both. Kind of plan
Yeah,
both.
it's hard to take one away and then you can't take them away.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by outcome, because I certainly don't want to, either for myself or for my players, have the outcome already determined. Like their choices are going to matter. It's just whatever, just have kind of more short term goals for decisions that need to be made, or key conflicts that are going to arise in terms of the overall like narrative. And basically, my goal is advancing the campaign's narrative. And whatever needs to be done to advance that narrative is what's going to be in this session.
Yeah, I very much think of the role of DM as a steward of the narrative. You are the one just keeping everything moving along through whatever device that is you choose to use.
Yeah, and I think I definitely think that I set the end point of where I want to expect to end, and then I definitely do plan like, okay, well, here will be a social interaction, and then here's going to be a combat, or they're going to then move to like finding something. It's like I definitely plan those out, but I think you're right when you start giving these, an NPC gives a social hook to this idea, or you find out information about that idea, and then your players start moving you in these directions, and then you say, okay, well, combat's out this session because we never got to that. We never got to that thing because the players chose. So even though I do plan, what we're going to do exploration, then we're going to do a social, and then I think we're going to get into the combat here. I do plan that, but then you got to be flexible with the players to say, okay, well, they chose this direction, and that's totally not the direction that I had planned, and that's okay because now that is fodder for next session, right?
So I certainly will look at, when I set up a combat or whatever, I'll have different outcomes in mind. And certainly there's maybe 3 or 4 main outcomes that I think would happen. But, like Mike says, the players are the guide there, and whatever direction they take, if there's an unexpected outcome that I didn't foresee, you just got to kind of play along with that and see where that takes you. But I certainly look at it as like, I mean, I don't necessarily utilize the pillars of construction personally. I just plan my
So,
session.
John, would you say then, if like a new player was to come to you and ask you, I read this in the Dungeon Master Guide, after saying you don't own one.
I do not.
Yeah. But I mean, after that, would you say to them, you don't really need to worry about that? That'll happen? Or like, what would your guidance be to a new person?
Well, I mean, no, as a new person, I think, yeah, absolutely read that DMG and get in tune with what the information is in there. But as someone that's been playing for a long time, I think I have a good understanding about what needs to happen within sessions and out of sessions and over the arcing current of a campaign, right? So that 3 pillars is something newer to me that I haven't really been familiar with. So obviously I read up on
it. Been there since the beginning. It just was never codified in words in a book, right?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Sure. I mean, I actually look at it more like Mike says, where combat, non-combat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that's where my mind takes me.
If I had a new player ask me about that as it's written in DMG, I would just tell them that, I mean, kind of like Monopoly, everyone has their house rules. It's learn the standard game, practice with this, design a couple adventures, and these are good guidelines. And as you play them, and as you play a couple, you're going to see which ones you feel more comfortable with, and you're going to see which ones your players respond more to, and those will be the ones you lean towards going forward, or that you'll make us. Or if there's one that you feel weak on, you'll make a specific point of doing more research on that or practicing more with that. And I mean, it's kind of like any other skill. You kind of have to be okay sucking when you first start out and just be like, I'm just going to get out there and try some stuff, and I'll see what works, what doesn't, and like what works will get reiterated, what doesn't work will be worked on and improved.
You got to be okay sucking like 20 years in too, I think. It's a lifetime of learning that
sucking doesn't stop.
I mean, that's also giving yourself permission, but everyone has a bad day too. Everyone has their off days. Everyone has bad sessions.
Well, I certainly don't judge a DM on one session unless they're assholes, right? Like, I think it's tough.
Graphically wrong, right?
I think it's tough to judge a DM on one session because you don't really see how they weave the story into it. And sometimes you might find, well, this is another good question. What if you find a DM that is like all combat or all role play or something like that, right? Like that's their thing. That's what they go to. That's their go-to every time. Does that tend to bother you? Or you probably knew that maybe going in, right? But that if your go-to is like, well, I know that I can always chew up time with a combat or chew up time by inserting more NPCs or something, I mean, it's hard to deal with as a player, but as a GM, I don't know. What are your thoughts on other GMs that do that, right?
As long as their players are happy.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say, is if the expectation at the table is that that's what kind of game it is and that's the kind of game we want to play here, then play it. I mean, far be it from me to judge you.
Yeah, and as long as you're into that too, then otherwise you leave that table, right?
Exactly.
If you're like, I'm not a combat guy and it's all combat, then all right, it doesn't work.
There's
doesn't
definitely
have to always work.
You're playing D&D and you're not a combat guy?
There's
3/4 of the book is about combat.
No one ever, right?
Oh yeah, and you can travel and search for stuff and talk to people, but most of the book is combat.
I've definitely left tables though for that reason, and not without hard feelings. Just like, yeah, it's just not per se my thing. But
Mhm.
have at it, guys. Have fun.
Yeah. No hard feelings on any of that as well. Like,
Yep.
I think.
If anything, I just want to know more up front because it may impact what kind of character I create for the table. Do I want a more, because we all probably have a library of character ideas in our head. It's like, okay, am I pulling out the more combat focused I've had, where I really want to lean into the one that's going to be relatively ineffective in combat, but has some cool role playing aspects. Like
Yeah,
that's going to impact my character design and character creation.
you're absolutely right.
That's another
Good
benefit
min-max
of
Mike coming out for the
Min-max.
for the paladin sorcerer.
No, but it's true. Like if you've got a glass cannon and it's like, oh, by the way, I'm really into role playing, then you're sort of like, you're up shit creek, man. It's like, well, I have no charisma. I can blast things, but here we are talking to everyone. I'm bad at this. Like for my character roles,
Yeah.
shit. Like this sucks,
You
right?
gotta
Like,
keep your character right. You got to think of your characters first and foremost in all those situations for sure. Your players need to be involved, enjoy what you're doing and what you're providing.
that's why they created multi-class, right?
yeah.
And also goes like if you're doing a DM that does no exploration in some of the most classical interpretation, maybe don't play the ranger at that table. If you're never going to see the wilderness, like maybe.
Well,
Maybe your character's background isn't he's into archaeology. Let's just.
Does that annoy you? That sort of annoys me. Like, I forget what it's called, but there's a certain ability where it's like you can't get lost. It's like, what the fuck is that? Like, you can't get lost. Like, that sucks.
That's not one of those 3 pillars, Dan. That's for sure.
I mean, like, hey, we all know that exploration is hard. But how about this? Let's have a guy that can't get lost. Go fuck yourself. Like, get out of there. Like, you can't get lost.
What is that? Is that
D&D, what DM says
Like
goes.
a hedge maze or something at that person,
Yeah. You're in the Minotaur maze. Can't get lost.
There
I know
you go.
exactly where to go.
Yeah, I don't know because that's magical, right? Isn't
Yeah, there's that. That's true. It's a magical.
Non-magical, right? So that's you throw something like that at him.
How about this? You know which is north, south, east, and west, but you still have no fucking clue where you are. You lost.
Straight up use that with players before as a way to signal to them that something is not right with the environment, that you have this ability and yet for the first time in your life you have no idea where you are, and this forest has strange smells and strange sounds that you were not familiar with, and suddenly now they're on edge, and they did not respond in a negative fashion. They responded in a intrigued and concerned fashion, but it also goes to just making sure your table is one where you enjoy playing with everybody.
Yeah.
Also,
your guy, you mean? Yeah, sure.
Also, note this out. Next guy for Dan's campaign does not get lost, whatever that means.
Yeah.
So I remind myself to take that.
I'm not worried because nobody plays Rangers. Do people play Rangers?
No. I think they tried to fix them, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, they unearthed Arcana that to get a little improvement there.
Yeah.
The only thing they did to Rangers was unearthed Arcana. They took away can't get lost. They're still just as bad, but now they can get lost. So Dan feels better about them.
So, gentlemen, what am I missing on the 3 pillars discussion? I mean, it sounds like if I were to recap, it's not as big of a deal as a new DM might think, and that they should more focus on the story arc, but in association with knowing that pacing should be changing every once in a while, but not to be afraid of a session that's one thing or the other. I mean, what would you guys say?
I think the most important thing that we said was know your table. So I think above anything else, of any of the pillars or any of those things, is just know what your players want, and if you guys are jiving on whatever it is, all combat heavy or social heavy, whatever it may be, then keep doing what you're doing, and that's probably going to work out for you. And set those expectations as well.
Mm-hmm. I'd say to kind of help John's point along there, as a guide to myself when I'm creating, I'm always thinking, what can I do to keep these people on their toes? Know your table in that sense as well, not just their preferences, but what their expectations may be about where the story is going. So you can zag when they zig, or you can create reveals as Mike was talking about earlier, or different.
I'm going to make a note of that right now, John. I like that a lot.
Just so you're kind of thinking of different ways of pushing narrative forward rather than getting stuck in the same old devices.
And to supplement that, I would also say be aware of what their capabilities are so that you can challenge them.
That's a great point.
Because that's maybe another one of my goals is, first of all, to me, being a DM is not a competition. If you want to kill the players, you can just kill the players. You can drop an ancient dragon down at any point and just kill them. I like to challenge my players, but to me, challenge is in that idea of like, it stops being rote. They have to actually think. They have to strategize. They have to cooperate. Like they have to expend resources or approach something in a new way. I just try to give them something new every session, even if it's not new to the players, at least new to the characters. Maybe these characters have not seen this monster before, or if the players have seen a particular monster, well, now it's in a different environment or it's acting in a new way. And this is where, again, like a brand new location, a puzzle, a new NPC, something they haven't seen yet in the campaign is just something fresh for them and makes them like pause for a second and just say, how am I going to approach this?
I think that's a really good point to also put it. What can be fresh? What can be new? If it's a new NPC, a new monster, a new plot hook, a new something, that will continue pushing the narrative forward and also feel like your world is bigger, right? Like, so I like that. What can I introduce that is new today? Because it might be lore, right? Like, or something like that. What is going to be new today? That's a good way to, especially on like longer campaigns, right? I mean, you can fight humans all day long, but like, what's going to be new this session that hasn't been done in the past 5? And I don't think that's too much to ask for like a session when you're planning a session. One thing that's new, that's going to push them in some new direction.
Yep, I think that's fantastic advice. And
new information has come to light, man.
to reiterate Mike's point there too, that if you're aware of what your players' capabilities are, that can help you so much in getting guidance about what those things can be that they have a modicum of a chance of success at, or is really tough for them, depending on how you're trying to set it up. If you don't have anybody who can pick locks, but you have all kinds of lock picking needs in your session, that could be interesting. Or you could want it so that they walk through these doors and get to the next MacGuffin, whatever that happens to be.
Yeah, I don't worry about stuff like that. It's like, well, none of you rolled a rogue and you're all wearing plate mail. That's a thing.
Guess you're going to have to knock this door down.
Yeah, you're going to fail forward somehow.
Yeah.
Fail forward. Yeah.
I think it's more, but to me also it goes to the idea of not presenting them with something you think will be a challenge, that they solve like that as well. That, no, because I've made that mistake before of putting forth something that I think will be very challenging, and I was not aware of a particular ability a character had, and it just basically nerfs the entire encounter. And not that I was trying to, TPK, but, I was expecting maybe a 3 or 4 round combat, or I was expecting some long drawn out creative solution. It's like, nope, I have the spell. It's over.
And there goes 30 minutes. Yeah, one time I had a 500-foot cliff that was, insurmountable. And one of the guys was like, yeah, I just teleport. And I'm like, what? What's the range on teleport? 500 feet.
500 feet. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that sucks.
See you later.
That's not fun anymore. But I have to go back.
That's when you have to make the 550-foot cliff. Like, but
right.
The 501-foot cliff.
Exactly right. Yeah, but at that point, I just roll back on like, hey, you know what? They use a resource, so
yeah.
There goes 30 minutes of my plan.
Well, most recently in one of my combats, one of the characters had a weapon that charmed water-breathing creatures or whatever, and the combat was a water-breathing
Very
creature.
specific thing. That
Yeah.
did
Yes.
that.
So, and luckily he used it on one of the minimalist guys and not the main big bad evil guy, but it could have been really bad. I mean, like, I looked at it afterwards and I was like, wow, I really did not think about that. Like,
Yeah.
but it all worked out. But I thought, maybe I could have really came close to failing myself really bad on that combat.
All right, so we're about at an hour here, fellas. So thank you for the discussion. I think that was really good. Certainly came away with a couple of things. Always have something fresh and new, and that'll lead you forward here. So this is the Dice20 Collective, and hopefully you've enjoyed our discussion, and hit that subscribe button. Until then, keep rolling.
Keep rolling.